Good morning, human. The Citizen Management System regrets to inform you that your cricket rations have been reduced for the current cycle due to social credit metrics. Water is unaffected. Please modulate problematic behavior and non groupthink for increased rations. Remember, score up, crickets up. Ready? Let's go. Today, we are going to discuss Charles dropping his philosophical masterpiece on the current trend toward a Schwabian dystopia as the default and how we as a global human species can strive to avoid it. If you feel like the letters placed on our friend's head there, evoking imagery of scarlet horns, is only slightly over the top, or if you're finding value in these videos each weekday, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. Your boy Charles has outdone himself today. Look at all this writing. Look at all this writing he's putting on his blackboard for you. And you know there's going to be a lot more where that came from. That writing is going to expand. We're going to zoom out. There's going to be a lot more blackboard writing before we're done today. But I will say, in my humble opinion, this amounts to a little bit of a masterpiece, a little bit of a philosophical masterpiece on how the current trend for human beings over the 21st century is toward a default position that's pretty dystopian, pretty dark, pretty unpleasant for human beings. Charles thinks we're headed in a direction sort of inevitably where we end up at this default position that is not a preferable future for human beings, and then he's going to explain how we avoid that future. So this all revolves around his conception of 5 pillars of the 21st century. So these are AI, quantum computing, synthetic biology, nanotech, and blockchain technology. And he's going to explain how every one of them can either extend things or regulate things. And a lot of the extension or regulation could be humans. It could extend humans or regulate humans, sometimes in very unpleasant ways. So let's jump right into it. AI, this is synthetic cognition we're talking about, the extension of your brain to a second brain that can access the internet and is recursive, since GPT-4 can be used to build GPT-5. So we all know GPT-4 it cannot access the internet up to date. It cannot access the internet as we see it today in 2023. It's held back a little bit, and there's plenty of discussion online about why OpenAI is doing that, which you might agree with or might not agree with, but we can all agree the large language model that is GPT-4, it can access the internet up until a couple years ago, and that's good enough access for it to perform in the brilliant ways we've seen it perform. But the key here is that the AI we're seeing is still bound to the parameters of classical computing. And the thing that will drag it past that, extend the AI, will be quantum computing. Quantum computing will extend AI beyond classical computing. Once we get to that point, once the AI is able to be extended beyond classical computing via quantum computing, we can talk about things like breaking Satoshi's keys. So we all know nobody has Satoshi's private keys. Otherwise, they would take all of his Bitcoin, which would probably lead to, let's call it, some price action in Bitcoin. There will be an impact on the price of Bitcoin if anybody can show that they can move Satoshi's hoard of Bitcoin around. So we'll be in this position where AI will amplify humans, and then quantum computing will amplify AI. And Charles even goes as far as to argue that AI will be better able to use quantum computing than humans. And he also notes that Penrose has written a paper on how the human brain has quantum computing properties itself. So if we think about, up until very recently, the most amazing sort of device for computation the most amazing, object for computation up until very recently has been a human brain. That's all changing right now. But Penrose is noting maybe that's because the brain does have some quantum computing property of its own. I haven't read that paper, but I'm sure you can find it if you're interested. The next pillar of the 21st century is synthetic biology. This is the changing of organisms. And under this heading, Charles talks about things like de extinction. Famously, he's invested in this project to bring back the woolly mammoth. Under synthetic biology, we can also extend certain things. We can add new capabilities to certain things. For example, we could hybridize human tissue and octopus cells to give human tissue this chameleon like capability to camouflage itself, much like an octopus does in the ocean or a chameleon might do on a leafy branch. So we have this extension to add capabilities or regulation to take away capabilities. And under this whole area, synthetic biology, we could also have extensions like human computer interfaces. Of course, everyone thinks of Neuralink. Charles also mentions a famous company called Synchron. And he says biological systems can be used to replicate computing systems. And this might even go beyond things like new interfaces under the sort of Neuralink group of activities. You might think of human or brain computer interfaces. But beyond just interfaces, we might also have things like storing data in DNA or in human cells themselves. The next 21st century pillar is nanotech. This is material science. It's the changing of any physical thing into a computer. Under synthetic biology, we talked about sort of turning organic things into computers, or at least them directly interfacing with computers. Now we're talking about turning anything, any non-organic thing, any physical thing into a computer. So for example, this could be any surface, like the surface of the table when you walk into the restaurant. It could become this gigantic e-ink touch display of some type where you could, scan your payment method and it could allow you to see the menu and order directly off the menu, all of those kinds of things. I mean, we have things that are somewhat close to this today, but we don't have, we don't have this in the sense that the table is a table and then all of a sudden it becomes a display. There's also an obvious interaction here between nanotech and synthetic biology. For example, you could cure cancer, according to Charles, by using nanotechnology to take control of the immune system and attack any cancerous cells in the body. That would be sort of an extension, or you could regulate the body to mitigate things like epilepsy. So obviously, when we talk, nanotech is something that we've talked about for a long time and has been, widely used in science fiction. And normally people imagine, much simpler things. But when you start talking about curing cancer, things like this, you get into an area of sort of human benefit that's far beyond, the kinds of things we've thought about in terms of science fiction a lot of times so far, where they're just like, talking about nanotech being able to change the color of a car on the fly or something like that. So Charles also stresses with all of these technologies, including nanotech, they're not really good or bad. They're just sort of neutral. They're just technology. He puts blockchain into this category as well. Blockchain is sort of neutral. It's just one of these technology pillars of the 21st century, but it's the one that governments have grappled the most with. And he's going to go on to explain exactly why that is. Charles has a view of the traditional world being governed by man-made laws. He thinks it works like this. There's a thought that is turned into a paper, like some kind of, work of not fictional literature, but an essay or a white paper, something like this. And then that essay or white paper, that paper becomes a law. We build social consensus on top of that law. And then if you break the law, we resort to physical punishment. And this system doesn't work very well in modern society where we have 1% of the US in prison. That's like not a great outcome. The other type of law would be like a natural law, like physics. We don't need to have a jail if you violate physics. Like if you try to do something that's contrary to physics, there's going to be an outcome, and it just kind of takes care of itself. We don't need to have physics jail. Physics takes care of itself. It's a natural law. And this is how digital systems can be as well. Digital systems can be more like natural law because they can be immutable. A blockchain operates like natural law. It's just there. If I send a bunch of ADA across the Cardano network to someone else, I can't get it back. I can't get it back. There's no way for me to take it back. I can't buy something from someone, send them the ADA, and then take the ADA back. If I could do that, then we would have to have Cardano jail. But we don't need to, because digital systems like blockchains operate more like natural laws in that they're immutable. If you jump off a building, you can't really take it back. You're going to fall. You're going to see the effects of gravity, whether you like it or not. If I send my ADA across the network, it's gone. I can't get it back, whether I like it or not. So there is no notion of compliance in these natural law-like systems, since compliance is built into the protocol and it's immutable. Once I send my ADA, we don't have to worry about having a compliance program to make sure I can't take it back, because I can't take it back. With nanotech and synthetic biology, you could turn our man-made laws into something that looks a lot more like these natural laws, where compliance is built into the system. We could create, with synthetic biology and nanotech, things like this: situations where you cannot violate the law. For example, Bob might have something built into his body so that his body physically will not violate the restraining order. It physically will not go within 300 meters of his ex-wife. Now we get into these issues, though. As soon as we start talking about things like this, it sounds good. Maybe if you've got a stalker, if Taylor Swift has a stalker, maybe that's a good result. Maybe the stalker can't help himself, people would argue. And it's better for him and for Taylor Swift if he has this if we use synthetic biology and nanotech to build something into his system so that his legs and his arms physically, even if he tried to drag himself, if his legs stopped working, his legs or his arms physically would not allow him to come within 300 meters of Taylor Swift. You could argue that's better for both of them. But now we're starting to get into issues of losing free will. And of course, anytime anybody mentions free will these days, people are going to bring up Sam Harris and talk about the extent to which they do or do not think free will is a thing. But let's just use the term free will to the extent you believe in it, which I know is not everybody these days, but to the extent you believe in free will, or at least the illusion of free will, there is this issue about losing that, whichever one you think it is. So it's not only that, though, because we could have an AI lawmaker. If we think that AI is this unbelievable improvement in cognition over humans, so much so that humans maybe won't even be able to understand how much, the extent to which AI cognition has eclipsed human cognition, we would probably be trending towards some kind of an AI lawmaker, because the AI lawmaker, it would be argued, would be better at making law than human lawmakers. Here's the problematic part. The AI lawmaker can make all the laws it wants, but it would need technology to enforce the law. There would have to be some kind of technology to enforce the law. So with that in mind, let's now talk about where things have sort of been going broadly in terms of policy. Charles's view of the world is that we're currently in the biggest social experiment sort of in the history of mankind. This is the current trend of this century. We're going from 20th century capitalism to ESG. We're cannibalizing 20th century capitalism in the name of ESG. And this is all sort of in view of a perception that we have diminishing global resources. We're running out of resources, so we need to run toward ESG. What is ESG? ESG is environmental, social, and governance. And Wikipedia breaks that down for us like this: environmental. Data is reported on climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity loss, deforestation, reforestation, pollution mitigation, energy efficiency, and water management. Social. Data is reported on employee safety and health, working conditions, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and conflicts and humanitarian crises, and is relevant in risk and return assessments directly through results in enhancing or destroying customer satisfaction and employee engagement. Governance. Data is reported on corporate governance, such as preventing bribery, corruption, diversity of board of directors, executive compensation, cybersecurity and privacy practices, and management structure. Wikipedia tells us this is a framework that considers the needs and ways in which to generate value for all organizational stakeholders, such as employees, customers, and suppliers, and financiers. So you can understand why some would argue this is a cannibalism of 20th century capitalism, because capitalism, via many people's definitions, is a means to ensure the efficient allocation of resources via self-interest. And here it appears we're not operating that way. Now we need to be interested in the stake, the interest of others, including suppliers, financiers, employees, customers. And certainly there's shades of gray. Every successful corporation in 20th century capitalism surely had to be concerned about their customers, their employees, their suppliers, their financiers, all of those things. But this is definitely a different premium placed on those sort of interest groups, and it's a little bit different than the efficient allocation of resources you have with the self-interest in 20th century capitalism. A more strident criticism might be that this is all exactly the kind of thing that leads to an inefficient allocation of resources. So a lot of that was obviously just me editorializing, but if we come back to Charles's video, he says that every industry is being affected by ESG, and it's basically a $150 trillion price tag to convert over to that system. There is no governance layer currently for ESG, but it's everywhere since it's being used to regulate carbon emissions, supply chains, hiring practices, interaction between humans generally, corporate governance, and etc. The governance layer for ESG will eventually emerge. There will be a governance layer that will emerge for this new system. Charles describes it as a meta government. So this governance layer would have to be a one world government of humans, which we know just by the very label, just by saying those words, that would be very difficult to achieve. Or it could be CBDCs plus social credit scores, which would be much easier to achieve. I think we know that almost every single central bank in the world is already on the CBDC road. They're already on that path. Adding the social credit scores piece, that's the piece that they're not necessarily talking about. Everyone except for the CCP. Of course, the CCP already there. They're already there. But it is notable that a lot of the same people who are interested in these kinds of things seem to look up to the system of governance of human behavior in China as some kind of a model that should be imitated. And when we think about this concept we already discussed of a quantum-enabled AI, what this would amount to would be a panopticon. This is something I've talked about on the channel before. A panopticon was this idea of a prison where you have sort of a central guard shack that can see into every single cell in the prison. The cells would just kind of be like around the guard shack, and the guard shack could look into every single cell in the prison, while the prisoners couldn't necessarily see what's going on in the rest of the prison. It's panopticon. So the central node can monitor every single citizen of the ecosystem. And this would be combined with the AI lawmaking we talked about before. So we'd have AI lawmaking enforced by CBDCs plus social credit scores. Of course, this sounds like a big conspiracy theory, but Charles thinks this is actually the default. This is where we actually end up. Nation states would no longer be in control. The protocol would be in control. This is because the first four pillars are inevitable in Charles's view. We have AI, quantum computing, synthetic biology, and nanotech. Charles says these are the inevitable four horsemen of the 21st century, and they will be brought to us by capitalism. They're coming whether we like them or not because they'll be valuable. And capitalism means the valuable things. People always strive to build out the valuable things. And all of these things, AI, quantum computing, synthetic biology, and nanotech, these are going to be very, very valuable because synthetic biology and nanotech alone might bring us things like near immortality. Charles is constantly talking about Hoskinson health sciences, or whatever he calls his sort of like longevity business, his medical longevity business. And he says, hey, every billionaire is investing money in this. Like, we're going to get pretty soon, we'll get something that looks a little bit like more immortality. Or at least near immortality, because so much money is being thrown at it, because every billionaire, of course, wants it. So we have these four horsemen coming via capitalism, but they might be used sort of in combination to create this dystopian future that's very non-capitalistic. The meta government we discussed would be the regulating layer. We've already seen it with the one world response to COVID. Think about it. It wasn't a one world government that got the entire world on board for the COVID response. It was other things. It was something that looked a little bit more like a meta government. Charles says, like we discussed, they look up to China as the model for perfect governance. So it has to be either, what we end up with has to be either a one world government that looks like a pyramid with people living like gods and kings at the top and slaves at the bottom. Charles thinks that people like Sam Altman, the Sam Altmans of the world, are embracing this conception of the world where only the philosopher kings are given access to the tools that govern the world. Charles thinks the people who are behaving like a Sam Altman, this is their conception of the world. They know they're going to be at the top of the pyramid, so no reason to create something that doesn't look like a pyramid because they're already going to be there. He thinks they're not concerned about the status of the people at the bottom, which Charles thinks will be akin to slaves. So when he says one world government in this section of the video, he's not saying it's going to be a human government, because I don't think Sam Altman Of course, the alternative to this in Charles' view would be a horizontal or circular system that's in opposition to the pyramid with the god philosopher kings on top and the slaves at the bottom. Instead, we have this circular or horizontal system based on open source protocols where everyone has access. This would be equality by design, guarantees of rights, transparent governance, sharing of knowledge, and concern for the developing world. And you could still care about the environment, about sustainable business practices, about proper governance, about proper hiring practices, all of these things that we currently care about. It's not an abandonment of those things. It's just doing all this in a transparent, circular or horizontal way where everyone has access and everything's happening transparently. Charles thinks blockchain can liberate us and give us this horizontal or circular system because blockchain gives you control of your money, identity, data, voice for things like voting, and privacy. So the crypto world definitely has its amount of ills. There have been, scams and rugs and robbery forest incidents, of course, all over crypto. But blockchain technology also gives us these things. It gives us the opportunity for something that doesn't look like this panopticon global surveillance meta state, it gives us something different where we do have privacy, voice, data, identity, money, all under our own self-sovereignty. What we're seeing right now in the media is that a lot of the media thinks there's no use case for blockchain technology. We saw this with the tweet from yesterday, where a famous figure who sort of does technology reviews on YouTube and elsewhere said that AI was making the use case for crypto look dumber and dumber by the day, or something like that. And this is a lot of this is kind of a response to that sort of sentiment. People in the media saying there's no use case for blockchain, but it's sort of like the use case for blockchain has been the same ever since the Satoshi white paper. Satoshi white paper, a big part of that was self-sovereignty over your own money, over your own assets, over ownership of assets. And that's true today. We've just added some of these other things like self-sovereignty over identity, data, personal voice for voting, privacy, these kinds of things. Charles thinks what these people in the media who are saying there's no use case for blockchain technology, what they're really saying is that they don't value self-sovereignty, and we should just give control to the philosopher kings. We should submit to the pyramid, submit to our place in the pyramid. And he thinks that a lot of people would say that because they think they're going to be at the top of the pyramid, so they don't care. They would happily give up freedom of association, commerce, and expression, which Charles calls sort of like the ACE entities, Association, Commerce, and Expression, ACE. They would give that up for the rest of us because they think they're going to be at the top of the pyramid. A blockchain would mean that no one can control your association, commerce, and expression. The natural law would be self-sovereignty over those things. Charles describes this as the terminus of the Enlightenment. This is where the thinkers of the 17th and 18th century would have wanted us to go. He also reminds everyone there's no way out of these four horsemen. They're coming no matter what. They're inevitable. And the world in 2100 will be inconceivably different than the world in the year 2000. The control of humanity that could be provided by these technologies will be unbelievably beyond the very worst Stalinist dictatorships, because given the four horsemen, the dictator, who in this case might just be the protocol, could literally read your thoughts. People will argue in favor of it unbelievably. Charles notes, how quickly did we go from slow the spread to papers, please during the pandemic? Charles thinks the default for the future, if we do nothing, is this kind of ESG dystopia enforced by CBDCs and social credit scores. And we only get out of this if we invest heavily in this kind of horizontal or circular open source system. So obviously I've done a lot of editorializing here, so don't ascribe all of my words to Charles. I certainly put words in his mouth as frequently as possible, but I think this is whether you believe that this is just a grossly overstated conspiracy theory, or you think there might be something here, I think these kinds of thoughts are at least worth looking at, because even if you think there's a 10% chance of this kind of ESG dystopia, it's so catastrophic that it's something we need to be thinking about. And if the way to avoid this is to invest in open source protocols and this sort of like horizontal or circular system, it seems like that would be a good thing anyways. Like, when has open source been a bad thing? I think we would all agree that in the vast, vast majority of the cases, open source has always been a better thing. So maybe it's worth considering. Even if you think this is a conspiracy theory, maybe it's worth considering the catastrophic impact of this kind of an outcome. And no matter what timeline you think that's on, whether you think it's in, 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, it's pretty catastrophic. So no reason to freak out today, but something to think about. Otherwise, I hope you're having a great week, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.